Figure out where in the innovation sort of that uncertainty lies. So it's a simple experimental model. So experimental implies things like risk and trying things out. So, trying to think about what you want to experiment with. And you can do that with all or part of the proposed solution. A prototype doesn't necessarily have to cover everything. It can be components of it. So another question you'll ask yourself is, what are the parts that I really need to test? And we'll give a couple of examples later today of how we've done that. It's used to test ideas quickly or cheaply. So by which we mean you can invest a relatively small amount, but get a lot of results without hopefully wasting a lot of time and resources. And the reason you're doing this is to validate or refine or change an idea. So an architect might create a diagram or a sketch, a rough sketch or a scale model various times during the process before they build the full building. And that feedback allows them to get those inputs and feel their way along and make improvements along the way. And that feedback that they get on those sketches and those diagrams and those scale models, if they're using it proactively to get feedback, it doesn't necessarily feel like failure. It feels like an opportunity to incorporate useful inputs. So what do prototypes look like? There are really many different ways to prototype. And in fact, there are no right or wrong answers about it. It can be something like a model, a 2D or a 3D model involving materials. Sometimes when people do product design, or just if this is the way you help visualize and it's playful for you and it's fun, then this may be a useful tool. You might create a digital prototype, something using a simple piece of software that allows you to just sort of pull together a diagram or a mock-up of it. You can also create actually, kind of paper prototypes as well. It doesn't have to be digital, something that helps you externalize your idea. The goal, of course, is to allow you to shape your idea and try out your proposed solution and allow people to give you that feedback. So what should you prototype? The first challenge, of course, is figuring out how to think about changing your design into your prototype. So you might ask yourself, what's important about your design, and maybe what's risky about your proposed solution? Is there some core aspect of your design where you can focus on trying it out? What do you really want to know? What are you curious about at this time? So early on, the prototype might even just be for yourself, to help you sort of start to visualize what it looks like. You're the first audience, of course, and you might realize you need to add some things or change them even when you look at it before you even to show it to others. And then once you've had something a little bit more concrete, it quickly becomes a tool for you to communicate with others on your design team and with your stakeholders to get feedback on that. So I would argue that good design really is collaborative on many levels. So you'll really want to think about what kinds of questions you want to answer. And you don't have to read all of these, but I just put a few examples up of the kinds of questions that might go through your mind. So you might be interested in knowing if instructions are clear and can students do the task, something sort of practical. Or you might want to know if it's engaging, or if the level is too challenging or too easy. So you'll think about those questions. You might prototype the thing where you have that question to try it out and get information back. So prototypes, of course, can also take many different forms, as we talked about before, but they also can sort of have different ways that they feel. They can be sort of rough and descriptive, perhaps. So Jennifer did a really nice job talking about the open story tool. And she might have, an initial idea might have been a description. Okay, we're going to make an online activity where students drag and drop pictures and make stories. So that's a descriptive, and that's still gives you a sense of the idea that they were working toward. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you can actually create something that is experiential. So you might make a mock-up. You can allow people, even with paper, to take sticky notes and rearrange them in it and create a story and pretend they're pushing buttons and pretend there's a computer there. And that's a fantastic version of a prototype. It also allows you to sort of try out the ideas and give someone a sense of what it might look like because they can do it, right? So you can describe it or you can allow people to do it. Both of them are reasonable if they all get you to help you come up with it. I think you sort of in your mind probably have to describe it first, but I'd encourage you quickly as possible to try to come up with something that helps you interact with the idea and give you a feel for it. So much of the work that I do comes from the field of game design. But I think the lessons are still relevant. This is from a blog post that a game designer wrote and talked about lessons in prototyping, but I think they're just as relevant for this group as they are for others. So a few things to keep in mind. Answer a question. That's what we just were talking about. So like any good experiment, the focus should be on answering one or more questions. Think about what you want to find out when testing your idea. You don't want to have too many questions, you know, trying to answer 30 questions at once. You may not get all the answers, but you might be able to think about really focusing on one or two, and then you'll be able to try it out and answer that. The second point is really important. Forget quality, but I need to explain this. You might think, oh, do you mean that the quality of the idea should be low? No, that's not what I mean. By quality, we mean the quality of the polish of the prototype. So you want to keep it sort of easy to make. So those paper-based prototypes, things with sticky notes, things that are just easy to put together, you might say, oh, it doesn't look very nice, or the artwork, I can't draw and my thing needs pictures. I'm the worst artist and I can draw stick figures, but those are good enough for these purposes. So please don't put pressure on yourself to be a good quality artist if you're not. If you happen to have those skills, that's wonderful, but please give yourself permission to make it rough and simple, and that's fine. The third point is don't get too attached to an idea. This is easier said than done. It's simple, but not easy, but it's still worth aiming for, which is try to be open to the fact that your ideas are temporary. So we talked about the early ideas, you know, the good ideas being the later ideas, perhaps. But the other flip side of that is you can't get too attached to the early ideas because you won't maybe give yourself permission to get to those later ones. So try to be really open and think about those ideas being things that can evolve from the very beginning, and it will help you, that it will allow you and give yourself permission that they can change. The fourth point is to prioritize your prototypes. So what do we mean by that? It's what I started to talk about before, which is if you're prototyping the thing you're really confident on and you think is really simple, okay, maybe you'll validate that. You could be surprised and it might not work, but I would argue that it's to your benefit to prioritize the really important parts of your prototype and perhaps the highest risk parts first, so that you can really dig in. If you have something and you get all the details worked out, but then you don't, the big thing you can't manage, you'll be painting yourself into a bit of a corner. So try to prioritize things that are important and potentially a bit risky, or things maybe you're very curious about, so that your priorities are most helpful, your prototypes are most helpful for you. And the last point here that I'll mention is, of course, it doesn't have to be digital. I think 2 of the 3 examples I showed, the diorama and the paper-based one, were very simple materials. I mean, you don't have to worry about it being digital. If you do focus on that, try to pick a tool which is really simple to use for yourself. Don't stretch so much that you're focused on the creating the digital prototype as opposed to actually trying to try out the idea. So I've done things in PowerPoint where I've just mocked up some screenshots because that's a software I feel comfortable with. I'm not very good in Illustrator or fancy programs like that, so I don't use them. I keep it simple, and I think that works out well for me. Do not be fancy. So remember, the prototype is not about getting it right the first time. The best prototypes, according to IDEO, a leading design organization, change significantly over time.